The noise of the crowd at the forum, the smell of blood from the gladiatorial arena, and the silence of the barracks. All of this was the face of the Roman Empire during times of harsh discipline. But imagine another side, 6,000 men dressed in identical armor and one order that decided their fate. The question that stood before them, obey or die. History knew many massacres, but rarely when the emperor himself raised his hand against his own army. What had to happen for an entire legion to find itself doomed? The answer to this question is hidden in one of the most terrible instruments of Roman military discipline. Ancient authors, such as Suetonius and Dio Cassius, wrote that discipline in the army was as merciless as the enemy's sword. In Rome there existed a special method of punishment, decimation. This word meant the destruction of every 10th man in a unit if it showed cowardice or rebellion. But sources hint that in rare cases the emperor's rage could demand much more. Imagine a formation of legionnaires, faces burned by the sun, shoulders bound by straps, heavy armor plates on their chests. This armor was called lorica segmentata, a set of iron strips that weighed about 9 kilograms. Warriors were accustomed to carrying this burden on themselves for hours, but far heavier was the burden of fear before the verdict. For a soldier of Rome, the fear of punishment was no lesser weapon than the sword in his hand. And here before us is the picture. A crowd of men shackled in iron, who know that the empire itself has turned away from them. Every heart beats like a drum, and everyone understands. Escape is impossible. But why? To understand, we need to return to the events that unfolded after the catastrophe that struck Rome's authority. After defeats and humiliations, emperors sought not only enemies from outside, but also the guilty from within. A legion that had lost honor became not simply a burden, it turned into a threat. After all, the army was the pillar of power, and if it showed weakness, the empire cracked from within. Soldiers who refused to execute an order violated the oath of loyalty, sacramentum. This oath bound them not only to the commander, but to the state itself. Violation of it was considered not a misconduct, but sacrilege. When thousands of warriors forgot about this, the emperor made a choice that forever entered history. Before us is not simply punishment. This was an act of intimidation, a blow to the heart of the army, a reminder to every legionnaire, no one is above discipline, not even an entire legion. And now the question arises before the viewer. What did a soldier feel knowing that the empire was preparing to erase him along with thousands of his comrades in arms? To answer, we need to see exactly how this execution was prepared. Ahead, a path through blood and iron, where each step led the legionnaires to the last formation of their lives. The Roman army was a machine, where every cog had its place and function. But when this machine broke, the consequences turned out to be more terrible than any defeat in battle. Historians noted that discipline was the main nerve of the legion. If one nerve rots, the emperor was ready to burn out all the flesh. Before the verdict was pronounced, preparation began. It was not spontaneous. This was a carefully calculated ritual of fear. The army was assembled in full armament on the parade ground, where everyone had to see the eyes of his comrade. This parade ground could accommodate up to 6,000 people, and every step on the stone slabs echoed with a rumble, as if the earth itself groaned under the weight of iron. Here the emperor or his legate announced the decision. A legate, this is the highest commander of the legion, the direct representative of the sovereign's will. He had no right to argue with the order. His voice sounded firm, like cut stone, for thousands depended on this voice. The Romans called the punishment process itself decimatio, but in case of mass mutiny, a far more cruel principle was applied, the death of the entire unit. The very thought of this turned the soldiers' breathing into a dry wheeze. After all, they knew behind each one stood not only a comrade in arms, but also family, wife, children. The loss of a legion meant that these families would lose not only breadwinners, but also honor and protection. Imagine the picture, rows of legionnaires lined up in a perfect straight line, shields drawn to their legs, spears, until trembling in their palms. The metallic clang of mail, the creak of straps, and the dry crackle of torches tear through the night silence. Above them flickers a banner with an eagle, Aquila. This eagle was the symbol of the legion's soul, its sacred heart. To lose the Aquila was considered shame, worse than death. And now the symbol itself, raised above the ranks, looked down on the doomed, like a judge upon the guilty. Soldiers carried about 25 kilograms of equipment on themselves. A sword, gladius, a shield weighing almost 10 kilograms, armor, a supply of food and a flask of water. This burden made their marches almost endless torments. But today weapons did not save, they turned into mockery. The sword, created to kill the enemy, now prepared to kill the neighbor in formation. Inside the legion reigned a special atmosphere of expectation. Centurions, commanders of hundreds, walked along the ranks. Their voices sounded muffled. They knew that now their word would not save the soldiers. They saw how the fingers of young recruits trembled, how veterans who had gone through dozens of campaigns looked at the ground, not daring to raise their eyes. Before everyone's eyes was the same image. Death not on the battlefield, but at the hands of comrades. Historians note, punishment was never instantaneous. It was prepared with cold calculation. Soldiers were given bread and water, the last ration. The ice in the stomach became stronger when tribunes, junior commanders who rose through service, began to read the list of names. In case of decimation, every 10th man drew lots. But that day, rumors said that lots were not needed. The execution would touch everyone. And this knowledge killed hope. Archaeological data shows that at sites of such executions, they found pits with bones, neatly stacked in rows. This was not chaotic slaughter. This was the order of death, Roman order, brought to the limit. Thus the empire showed, discipline stands above life. In such moments, the legion ceased to be a combat unit and turned into a shadow of itself. The viewer may ask the question, what is more terrible for a soldier, to die in battle by the hand of an enemy or to fall by the sword of a brother in arms? But the Roman army knew the answer. The fear of internal verdict was always stronger than the fear of external enemy. The silence of the parade ground rang. Warriors heard each other's breathing like dying sighs. And when torches cast glints on the cold blades of gladii, everyone understood there was no way back. But the execution itself had not yet begun. Ahead was the most terrible thing, the moment when discipline and blood would merge in a single blow that would shake the entire army. And precisely there, at the beginning of the execution, history acquires an inhuman scale. Dawn over the legion's camp came slowly, as if the day itself did not want to see what was to happen. The sky was painted red, as if warning in advance of a sea of blood. Thousands of warriors stood in formation, arranged by cohorts. A cohort. This is a tactical unit of approximately 500 soldiers, the main building block of the legion. Now these building blocks were not supposed to defend the empire. They were to be broken. According to sources by Tacitus and Dio Cassius, such punishments began with absolute silence. Commanders ordered to lay down weapons, and the sound of swords falling to the ground was like the hammering of nails into a coffin lid. Warriors knew their gladii would no longer serve them for victory. They would become instruments of internal reprisal. The tribune stepped forward and loudly read the accusation. He spoke of violation of the oath, of shame, of the fact that the legion had shown cowardice or disobeyed a direct order. Each word cut the ear stronger than the blow of a whip. Soldiers knew no justifications would be heard. Sacramentum, the oath they gave to Rome and the emperor, was sacred. Its violation was considered betrayal not only of the army, but of the gods themselves. Imagine how a 6,000-strong mass stands in expectation, and each feels smaller than a speck of dust. Many years of training, dozens of campaigns, battles with barbarians, everything disappeared in an instant. Inside the legion reigned silence, and only hearts beat in unison. This rhythm was more terrible than battle drums, and here is the first order. Step forward. From each group they led out several people. In ordinary decimation, lots determined the victims. But if the emperor decided to destroy the entire legion, lots lost meaning. All that remained was doom. Soldiers had to execute the sentence themselves. Those who remained in formation beat and finished off their comrades with clubs and stones before delivering the final blow with a sword. This was done intentionally. Rome demanded that fear and guilt fall on the shoulders of all. To kill an enemy, valor. To kill a brother, eternal trauma. It was precisely this trauma that was supposed to temper the remaining legionnaires so that the thought of rebellion would never arise again. Descriptions by ancient authors paint a terrible picture. Blood flowed along the ground, turning the camp's dust into viscous mud. The screams of victims tore through the formation, but no one had the right to turn away. Centurions watched to ensure everyone participated. If someone tried to retreat, he himself was thrown to the victims. Imagine the smell. The iron of blood mixes with the smoke of torches. Skin burns from the heat of armor. The throat dries up. This was not simply an act of punishment. This was ritual destruction, where fear became the main weapon of the empire. According to archaeological finds, at sites of such reprisals, they found bones that bore traces of blows not only from sharp weapons, but also from blunt objects. This confirms that victims did not always die immediately. They were finished off slowly, systematically, so that the spectacle would be etched into memory. But the heaviest thing was not in the blows themselves. Heaviest of all was the silence of those who still remained alive. After all, they knew their turn was still ahead. The eyes of legionnaires met, and in each gaze was silent recognition. We are dying not as warriors, but as victims of our own army. At that moment, Rome showed a monstrous paradox. An empire that built roads for thousands of kilometers, aqueducts, cities and temples could in one moment turn into the executioner of its own sons. And it was precisely this cruel duality that made it strong. But even more terrible was that ahead awaited the culmination, the moment when execution ceased to be selective and turned into total extermination. This was a blow that shook even those who were far beyond the borders of the camp. When the first bodies crashed to the ground, it seemed that the earth itself shuddered from the weight of armor and human flesh. But this was only a prologue. Soon, the execution acquired unprecedented scale. Now no longer dozens and not hundreds. Thousands of people understood. Their turn was inevitable. Sources report that it was precisely in such moments that the emperor's anger reached its limit, and the execution ceased to be symbolic. It turned into a weapon of intimidation directed at all of Rome. Soldiers, arranged in cohorts, stood under the ominous sign of the eagle. Aquila, the sacred banner of the legion, fixed on a long staff, towered over everything happening, like a cold witness. The eagle of gold or silver gleamed in the rays of the sun, and it seemed as if Jupiter himself was watching the execution of his children. To lose this symbol was considered shame worse than death, but today the very fate of the legion was worse than any shame. The punishment acquired a strictly defined rhythm. Each cohort was brought out to the parade ground in turn. Centurions, commanders of hundreds, gave the signal and began what the Romans called supplicium. This term meant not simply punishment, but torment brought to the limit. Warriors beat each other with stones and clubs, finished them off with swords and spears. Each blow echoed in the silence of the camp. The picture was more terrible than any battle. In war, death came quickly. The shield did not hold, the spear found its target, and a man fell. Here, death was drawn out. Soldiers knew they were killing friends with whom they had shared bread, water, and cold nights of campaigns. The eyes of victims met the gazes of executioners, and in these gazes was more pain than in the blows themselves. Tacitus wrote that such punishments were supposed to inspire terror, not only in soldiers but in future generations. The army became a spectator of its own destruction. The silence was interrupted only by groans and the hollow blow of iron. The sun rose ever higher, the air became hot and heavy, and the smell of blood mixed with sweat and dust. Losses were measured not only in lives. Each killed soldier was a carrier of experience, a veteran who knew dozens of military tricks turned into a nameless body. But for Rome this was secondary. The main thing was to show discipline is above reason, fear is above talent, order is above life itself. Imagine the movement of a column on an ordinary day. Each step of the legionnaire is measured, spears aimed forward, shields closed in a wall. This was called testudo, tortoise, a formation in which soldiers covered each other with shields, forming an iron dome. But today there was no tortoise. The formation did not protect, the formation destroyed. Each soldier was not a defender, but an executioner. Archaeological finds show that after such executions, camps had to be rebuilt anew. The earth was soaked with blood. Fires burned for days to cleanse the air. Sometimes remains were buried in common pits without names, sometimes left under the open sky, so that even years later the site would say, "This is what awaits those who disobey." The culmination of the execution was not only physical destruction, this was a psychological blow. Those who remained alive, if any remained, were never the same again. They became instruments of fear, carriers of horror who were supposed to tell other legions about what had happened. This is exactly how Rome spread discipline, not by laws, but by memory of blood. That day the execution went on for hours. The sun was setting and the parade ground was strewn with bodies. The red color on the ground no longer differed from the color of banners. The screams died down and silence fell that chilled the blood. The legion no longer existed as a military unit. It had turned into ashes, into memory, into a symbol that no one could challenge the emperor's power. But what happened next? After all, even after such horror, Rome did not stop. The empire continued campaigns, built cities, waged wars. And it is precisely in these consequences that the true scale of the tragedy is revealed. For the execution of one legion changed the fate of the entire army. When night fell over the camp, the execution was completed. The earth, strewn with bodies, resembled a battlefield. Only no enemy existed. Rome had killed itself. Warriors who survived this spectacle could never again look at sword and shield as before. In their memory remained not victories over Germans or Parthians, but the eyes of comrades whom they had finished off with their own hands. Ancient sources emphasize, after such an execution, the legion ceased to exist as a unified unit. Either it was completely disbanded, or the survivors were distributed among other parts of the army. A legion that had stained itself with shame had no right to continuation. It disappeared from the lists, as if it had never existed. For Romans this was worse than death. To disappear from memory, to lose name and glory. But at the same time, it was precisely such punishments that strengthened power. The emperor showed everyone, no one is above discipline. Even 6,000 armed men who had gone through dozens of campaigns could be destroyed by one order. This demonstration of strength acted not only on soldiers, but also on senators, and on provinces, and on enemies of the empire. Soldiers who were present at the execution returned to their camps like shadows. They no longer argued, did not grumble, did not refuse orders. Their hearts were shackled in the same iron breastplate as their bodies. They knew, if once the emperor could erase an entire legion, he could erase any of them. From a military point of view, the consequence was twofold. On one hand, discipline became iron. Soldiers obeyed even the most absurd orders. On the other hand, the army lost a huge number of experienced warriors. Veterans who could have taught recruits were dead. But Rome was so rich in human resources that it allowed itself such losses. Provinces annually supplied new recruits, and the wheel of war continued to turn. The term that defines the outcome of such events, exemplum. This word in Rome meant example or lesson. The empire used the death of the legion as exemplum for all others. Death turned into a visual lesson, into a monument to discipline, more terrible than any law. Historians debate whether the punishment really concerned a full legion or whether it was hyperbolized by ancient authors. Some believe that only every 10th was executed, others that in separate cases entire units were destroyed. But archaeological finds of mass burials and testimonies of ancient writers show cases of total reprisal really took place. The influence of such events was felt for decades. Legions became even more submissive but also more closed. Soldiers began to see in the emperor not only the father of the army but also its executioner. This fear turned the army into an instrument of absolute power. Imagine the consequences. Several years after the execution, the same Rome continued to build roads, conquer peoples, arrange triumphs. On the streets of the capital, citizens applauded the victors, but in the depths of army camps, the memory of that night lived in every whisper, in every glance. This was an invisible scar on the body of the empire. It is precisely for this reason that long-term consequences were not only military, but also psychological. Legionnaires understood they were not heroes, they were expendable material. The empire could glorify them one day and destroy them another. And this thought, like poison, slowly penetrated the consciousness of the army. But the story did not end there. After all, the final question remains open. Why was the empire ready to sacrifice thousands of its best warriors for one lesson? And what does this say about the very nature of power? The answer hides in the final point of this story, where the personal challenge is addressed no longer to the legionnaire, but to each of us. The darkness that descended on the camp seemed thicker than night itself. Where during the day the formation had thundered, now stood dead silence. The execution was completed, but its echoes did not die down. They lived in the memory of those who saw how an entire legion disappeared before their eyes, as if it had never existed. This was not simply punishment. This was a lesson written in the flesh and blood of Rome. Historians note, such reprisals were not a random outburst of anger. They were part of a system that kept the empire in check. When the emperor gave the order to destroy a legion, he acted not only as a commander, but also as a priest performing a sacrifice. After all, the army for Rome was not simply a military force. This was the sacred body of the empire, and if one of its parts rotted, it was cut off without mercy. The term that best reflects the essence of this practice, disciplina. For Romans, this was more than simply discipline. This was a word uniting order, obedience, loyalty, and readiness to die for an order. Without disciplina, Rome could not have held lands from Britain to Mesopotamia, and for its sake, the empire could destroy even those who just yesterday had been its shield. Imagine the scale: thousands of warriors, each of whom carried 25 kilograms of iron and leather on himself, each knew how to form into battle tortoise, each had survived dozens of battles, and all of this disappeared in one day. A legion that could have changed the course of future wars was erased by one stroke of power. This is like today destroying an entire army armed with the latest technology only because it once refused to carry out an order. Archaeological finds of mass burials where bodies are laid in rows confirm the stories of ancient authors. There are no monumental inscriptions there, no glory and triumph. There are only bones, silent witnesses that Roman discipline was dearer than human life. And yet it was precisely this cruelty that provided the empire with centuries of dominance. Legions that heard about that execution no longer dared to grumble. Fear became a weapon no worse than the gladius. As a result, Rome continued to build roads, conquer new peoples, create cities, while the memory of reprisals kept the army within iron frameworks. But how should we, people of modernity, relate to this story? In antiquity, such things were considered necessity. Today, however, the thought that one order can cost the lives of thousands causes horror, and yet the essence of the question is not in history but in man. How far is a person ready to go to preserve power, and how far is a soldier ready to go to preserve loyalty? Here opens a personal challenge to each viewer. Roman soldiers swore to serve until death, and death came not from the hand of an enemy, but from their own empire. Now the question sounds different. And what would you do if an order went against the very essence of your conscience? Could you obey, knowing that this leads to destruction? The finale of this story is tragic, but it shows what makes a human human. Rome built roads, cities, laws, but held on through fear. And even today, after centuries, the memory of the execution of an entire legion poses us the question, where does the boundary between discipline and humanity lie? And now, having learned this story, everyone can ask themselves, if I had stood in that formation, among 6,000 doomed men, what would have been stronger in me? Fear of death or fear of disobeying an order? It is precisely this question that is the main legacy of that execution. Not the stones of roads, not the walls of cities, but the shadow that lies on every generation. What is a person capable of for the sake of power? And what is a soldier capable of for the sake of an oath?